going to go ahead with the understanding that everybody can hear me and everybody can also see the slides that I have put up on my screen. If you can't hear me or you can't see the slides, please do let me know, let Antonina know so that we can fix it. My approach is very interactive. So I imagine myself sitting in a room with you all, or even better, sitting in a coffee shop with you and just having a discussion among colleagues. What that means is please feel free to jump in with questions, or if there's something that I say and that's not clear to you, just write in, okay? Please don't hesitate. And if there are any topics or themes that you would like to have me discuss with you also, please raise that. And what I think I'll do is just begin very quickly by addressing your curiosity on the meaning of credentialed evaluator, and just tell you a little bit about what that means and how that. So very simply, the credentialed evaluator designation is a designation that is given by the Canadian Evaluation Society. I'm Canadian, and I have been a member of the Canadian Evaluation Society for a very long time, since the 80s. The Canadian Evaluation Society was one of the first evaluation societies in the world, together with the American Evaluation Association. And about, I would say, roughly 10 years ago, after a lot of preparatory work, the Canadian Evaluation Society came up with a list of competencies. In other words, what is the knowledge, what skills, what are the abilities that somebody who wants to do evaluation and call themselves evaluation should have. And it then developed a process to check that, so that there is what is called a credentialing board, of which I am a member, and it consists of evaluators that have a long experience in evaluation of various competencies, and that will review applications to become a credentialed evaluator. So in very simple terms, that's how the process got underway about 10 years ago, and it's essentially the same, although there have been some improvements, and as with all processes, things have been made a bit easier, a bit lighter, less bureaucratic, and so on and so forth. If you go on the site, on the website of the Canadian Evaluation Society, you will find all the information you need to understand that credentialing process. It's not, you don't have to be Canadian, you can be from anywhere. The requirement is that you be a member of the Canadian Evaluation Society, and of course it's open to anybody anywhere, and that you meet some of the basic requirements, and then you can apply for the process. So that's what that means, and it's really the first established professional designation anywhere. Other associations are looking at that right now: the American Evaluation Association, the European Evaluation Society, the United Kingdom Evaluation Society are looking at putting in a comparable process. But for now, the only society that has that is the Canadian Evaluation Society. So I'll stop there. However, before launching into our discussion, is need a little bit more information. We'll get a lot of information on the website. So unless there's something very specific, I'm suggesting the website. But still, if you have a question, please put it to me. That's yes. That's a very a very good and a very important question. It doesn't do any harm, clearly. What you have to realize is that evaluation, even though in its current form, as we know it, evaluation practice started really in the late 70s, early 80s. It has grown, of course, a lot, and now you find it everywhere. And a lot of progress and development has been achieved. It is still a relatively young practice, or if you wish, a young discipline or a young profession, so that a lot of people, a lot of organizations, a lot of governments don't really know very much about evaluation. And the idea that somebody should be professional in evaluation is still new in a lot of regions and in countries. Now, having said this, most countries where there is more developed evaluation practice, I'm thinking, for example, Canada, what we are beginning to see are job offers or requests for consultants where they will indicate that being a credentialed evaluator is a requirement or something that's very, very positive. So we're beginning to see that happen. And I think it's just a question of time before there are more accreditation processes that are established, and then the market on the demand side is going to begin to ask that people be properly qualified. I see there's a question. Okay, can you send it to me now because it's in Russian? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I can read the microphone, so there you go. I'm starting to learn Russian. Right. Okay. So if everybody's comfortable, then why don't we just move to the discussion that I prepared for. When I talk about evaluation as valuing, it's something that seems rather obvious, but it's not, and I'll explain why. Hopefully, the title will make sense to you as we move through the presentation and our discussion. So let's go to the first impression slide. I think that come up well on screen. Okay, perfect. Everything is working. Great. What is evaluation? And I'm just going to start with what is probably one of the earliest and most accepted definitions by Michael Scriven, who is one of our great evaluation writers, or one of our great evaluation theorists, somebody who has written extensively. And I encourage you to look at some of his writings, because he is very much a deep thinker. So he first said, well, one way to think about professional evaluation is in a systematic way, determining the quality or the value of something. So, what do you mean by quality or by value? Well, one way to think about quality is to think about the merit of something. And what I'll do here is I'll use an analogy, I'll use an example. And so let's all imagine that we are sitting together in the cafe. They serve some food, and we decide together that we want to order something to eat. So the food comes out and it's put on the table, and we can see or know that the food, it corresponds to what we ordered. Okay, so I don't know, we ordered chicken, and the chicken comes out, and we know that we can see that it's chicken. We ordered it grilled, and it's grilled, and we think after tasting it that it's actually of good quality. We agree. Some of us might think it tastes better. Some don't think it's as good as the chicken they make at home. But quality can be thought of in two ways. And when we talk about intrinsic, it means that there's quality from the perspective of the amount of chicken that we get. We said let's order a whole chicken and we'll share it. Okay, so what comes out is one whole chicken, and we might find that the chicken is big enough to feed us all, or maybe not big enough. But one way to determine the quality is of this, to say, is there enough quantity? Okay, and we can decide that yes, there is enough, there's not enough. So we will do a quantitative assessment. Let's say we ordered two chickens or 10 pieces of chicken. If 10 come out, we'll go fine. We have a quantitative assessment of the quality of the chicken. There's 10 pieces, right? But then when we taste it, some of us might think it tastes so-so, average. Some think it doesn't taste very good. Some might think it actually tastes very nice. There, what are we doing? We're looking at a qualitative assessment, right? So the notion of merit is the extent to which the product or the service, and in this case, we're talking about a meal of chicken, has good quality, both in terms of the number of whatever it is. Okay, so that's a quantitative assessment, but also how good does it taste? It's a qualitative assessment. Okay, so that's the merit, if you wish, of the of in this particular case, the meal. Okay, so another way to think about this is to think of the meal that came out of the kitchen and ended up on our table as an output of the kitchen, right? It's an output of the restaurant. So when you are evaluating or assessing, and if you are looking, for example, at a project or a program, and you are interested in assessing the output of the program, and in the case, the output of the kitchen, which is the meal, typically you look at quality, but you will look at two aspects of quality. You will look at the quantitative aspect, and we'll look at the qualitative aspect. All right, and that's very important to remember, because quite often in evaluation, but also in monitoring, when we develop indicators in order to assess particularly an output, we tend to think that indicators should provide only quantitative data. In other words, we only think in terms of how much or how many. So if, again, we're in our cafe or in our restaurant, we just order a plate of chicken, and there's total, until there's 10 of us, right? If we get 10 pieces of chicken, we could say, well, it's good. We think the assessment is a positive one because we got the number that we asked for. The number is right. But on the qualitative side, if it tastes terrible and none of us end up eating it, then it doesn't really matter whether you have 10 pieces or 15 pieces or 5 pieces, does it? It really tastes bad. Okay, then we'll say, well, no, the output was not good. Our assessment would be a negative one. Okay, conversely, you can get only 8 pieces of chicken. There's 10 of us. On the other hand, the chicken is the most fantastic chicken any of us have ever tasted. Okay, so we might actually come to the conclusion that, well, it was actually really worth it because some of us are maybe small eaters and we're prepared to share a piece of chicken. All right. The point here, coming back to understanding the basics of what is evaluation, is, among other things, understanding this notion of quality, this notion of merit. And most of the time, we will apply this to outputs. Let me just quickly stop here before I move on to the next idea and check. Is all of this making sense to everyone? Does anybody not understand, or does anybody have a question? Okay, there's no messages going to understand it. Everybody's happy with this. Okay, so let me keep moving here. The second idea is the notion of value. Okay, or if you wish, another way to think of this is worth. Okay, so what is the value? Now, that is something that is, I would say, more encompassing, more varied, and it's something that, at least when we are thinking in causal terms, all right, when we are thinking in terms of cause and effect linkages, the kind of causal models that you get when you are using logic models, for example, input, programmer, processor, project, outputs, and then intended outcomes. Okay, so value typically is trying to assess relative to the key objectives, the intended outcomes of a project or a program. And there, what's important to understand that the notion of value is not absolute. It is relative to who are the intended results of the outputs. Okay, so let me go back to the example of we're in our restaurant and we've ordered our plate of chicken, which has arrived, and it's arrived in the right quantity. There's enough of it for everyone, and we've all tasted it. We've all thought, this is pretty good quality. It tastes good. So far, so good. We're happy. Okay. Now, what is the value of this meal? Well, it really depends on context. It really depends on circumstances of in our case, I would say the individuals that are gathered around the table. Now, just imagine if you have actually had a very nice meal only 2 hours ago, and now we're sitting around a table and you're again 2 hours later having a very nice chicken, that the value of that meal is likely different from someone who hasn't had anything to eat for 2 or 3 days. So the same plate of chicken will have a very different value depending on the circumstances of each of us. Continuing with our example, okay? So that's just a very simple way of beginning to understand the concept of value. Another way to think of the concept of value is that I may have eaten very well only a couple of hours ago, and now we're all sitting together around the table enjoying our meal. On the other hand, I lead a lonely life. I live by myself. I don't see many people, and quite frankly, my social life is not very exciting, and that is something that is difficult for me. And here I am sitting at a table with friends and colleagues enjoying a meal, but what's really important for me is that I am surrounded with friends and colleagues. I'm engaging in social interaction. And that to me is of value. Quite frankly, I don't really care about the chicken. Okay? What I'm really getting out of all of this is to be among other people and to be having social activity. Okay? So the whole thing might be of great value to me, but for very, very different reasons. Okay? So back to, you know, how can you begin to understand evaluation is by unpacking the ideas of quality, unpacking the ideas of value, and seeing how you can carry those key ideas through to the way in which we try to conduct. Okay? I'm going to check before I move on to the slide. Does all that make sense to everyone? If it doesn't, say so. If it does, then we'll leave it at that and I'll move forward. Okay, so I don't see any messages popping up. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Next slide, does that come up? Now it's okay. Okay, so we've explored together the fundamentals, right, of this thing that we call professional evaluation. What are some of the characteristics? And a good way to do this is to compare to other kinds of evaluative processes. Evaluation is not the only process that tries to assess. Okay. For example, in my practice, sometimes I'm asked to do a review. Well, assessment. It's a type of assessment, but a review, for example, will not have the requirement for evidence for systematization that evaluation would have. Okay, so generally, when I'm asked to do a review, typically it's what's called an expert review. I'm asked to look at an organization or a program that in an area where I know a lot. So I can very quickly find out what's going on. I can give you a pretty good idea of what's going well and what's not going well. Okay, so that's an example of a review. Now, research, of course, research will share a lot of the same tools as evaluation, and a lot of colleagues who do evaluation have been trained in research in some other fields. And we will use a lot of the same tools, whether these be data collection tools, or surveys, research tools, or evaluation tools. We will use the same analytical methods. We can do statistical analysis. We can do economic analysis. There are all sorts of tools. However, evaluation is different because research tends to inform and on the basis of checking a hypothesis. Okay, evaluation so that the answer is actually used. It's used for decision making. It's used for policy. It's for a number of things. Research tends to contribute to knowledge overall. Evaluation can contribute to knowledge. Generally, it's a specific area of knowledge, but more importantly, evaluation is intended to be used. If an evaluation is not used, then it doesn't have the full value that it should have. And here I'm thinking not just of financial audits, but of performance audits or operational audits. They will check to see whether a project or program did what it said it should do. Okay, so if the program says the objective is to do this or that, the audit check whether the program did what it said it would do. Okay, so an audit, on the other hand, will not check whether the objectives were relevant. Okay, the audit won't check whether there were other unintended effects. The audit won't question the fundamentals of whatever was being done. So it's important to understand that. Studies, there can be studies of all sorts of types. Again, there are some key differences for evaluation. And we don't have too much time. Usually when I go through the fundamentals of evaluation, it's part of a full day workshop. So I'm moving rather quickly here. But I'll leave you to think about, what are the characteristics of evaluation based on your understanding, your practice. And it's very useful to do that when you're trying to explain to somebody what it is that you do or what is evaluation. Compare it and explain, well, what's different, then makes it easier for others to understand what you're doing, okay? So just to give you an idea, evaluation is first and foremost for practical use. It's also for learning, even though research might also be for learning, but it's learning that's intended to be applied, okay? So it's applied knowledge. The other thing is that evaluation will look at unintended effects. Okay, what else happened? The program set out to do certain things, other things happened as well. What are those other things? And these can be positive, but they can be negative as well. Evaluation looks at that. Evaluation uses evaluative reasoning, okay? So it's not just a matter of collecting data of a factual nature and then saying, well, here's the data, okay? For example, a program to education, and part of what the program did was to build schools. An audit would say, okay, how many schools did you set out to build? 15. It would check, did you build the schools or not? Did you build 15 schools? And did they meet the norms and standards for building schools? An evaluation would look at that, but it would also look at, okay, then how were the schools used? Okay, did the students come? What was the quality, and so on and so forth. So it's much more, it's much wider. And it would ask on value. Okay, what is the value of the program for teachers, for students, for the families, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the government decided to invest in public schools. A lot of people might think this is a great idea. Well, if there's private schools, they might not think it's such a great idea because they've got competition. So just an example, all right? So another way to think about this is that the question is not finding out what works. We often hear that, okay? We need to find out what works. And you could probably find that out through a number of different ways. But in the case of evaluation, the question is what works for who, how, why, under what circumstances, says who, okay? Who's valuing, what perspective is being valued here, and so what? What difference is that going to make? And then what next, okay? Okay, let me move on to the next slide. All right, so everyone? I'm not busy eating chicken, right? Okay, let me come back to the slide. Let me check. Antonina, have you got the second? Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm going to move this again through this fairly quickly. For those of you who have done some evaluation or read evaluation reports or are interested in doing it, we often see evaluation and reports based on what is the purpose, the approach, the evaluation question, the scope, and the methodology. So I'm just going to very quickly share with you how I use those terms, okay? So what is the purpose of an evaluation? I read a lot of evaluation reports, and unfortunately, very often, what I read is the purpose of the evaluation is to assess so-and-so program, okay? Well, that's not the purpose, okay? The purpose of an evaluation isn't to evaluate. We know that. It's an evaluation, okay? The way to find what is the value that this evaluation is going to bring to people, to citizens, to the program, okay? In other words, if a government or a UN agency, if the commissioner is going to take money and pay evaluation, and very often these are public monies. Okay? Governments have money. UN organizations and other development organizations don't have money. All they have is taxpayer money, right? These are monies that come from workers. Never forget that. Okay, so this is not money that belongs to them. This is money that belongs to workers, taxpayers, and citizens. So the question is, what is going to be the value of doing an evaluation? So just try to imagine you want to explain to your neighbor who pays her taxes or his taxes, probably thinks that she pays too many taxes. Why should we be taking her money and doing an evaluation? Okay, and you better have a good explanation. Okay, so that's the way to think about purpose. What is the value that this is going to bring to people? Okay, that's purpose. What's an approach? Okay, an approach is essentially on what basis are you going to do your assessment? And what I mean by that is that there are different models for assessing. You can say, well, I'm going to use a cause and effect model. All right, I'm going to look at effectiveness, efficiency, impact. Well, that's a particular way of thinking about what's important. Okay, what's of value? So if you say, I'm going to look at impact or results and so on and so forth, what you are saying is that value is going to be determined by the extent to which the cause and effect linkages are true. Okay, you're saying, so if they are true, if the money went to the activities went to the outputs, the output went to the outcomes, and the outcomes contributed to the intended impacts, then this is good, right? So that's one way to think about it. But there are other ways to frame value. And another way is to say, for example, I am going to use a gender lens. Okay, what I am going to do is I'm going to think about value from the perspective of how responsive is a program to gender inequality. Okay, how responsive is it to equity between genders, different genders, and so on. And that would be another way of valuing. You could say, I want to use a systems perspective. And there, it's not whether or not a program has achieved impact or results, it's to what extent does the system, you no longer think in terms of program, but does the system that you're trying to understand, to what extent is it functioning optimally and, more importantly, sustainably? Okay, can this system be sustained? Because you can have a program or a set of programs that over 2 to 3 years might achieve their objectives. But the important question is, did these programs together as a system contribute to sustainability? So that's a different approach. And of course, you can mix approaches, all right? But one way to think about this is to be very clear about your frame of reference for valuing, okay? And this comes back to the example I was giving about sitting around, what is the value of this plate of chicken? Well, the answer, it really depends on the frame of what you're using. So when you decide or explain your evaluation approach, that's what you should be able to communicate clearly. Then you need a question. What is the evaluation question? Right? What is it that we're trying to find? And this is very important because evaluation, what we are trying to do is to contribute to knowledge and to knowledge for action. So getting the question, or the goal if you wish, right, is an important one. Without a clear question, it's very difficult to move to the next steps. Scope is what we call the evaluand. What is it that you're actually looking at? What are the boundaries? Okay. Excuse me. So another way to think about scope is to think about what is it that you are not going to be evaluating. So for example, when I conduct evaluations, or at least I used to, I always, my scope statement made it very clear that I was not assessing individuals. Okay. And this is important because it might seem obvious to us as evaluators, but somebody who hears, oh, there's somebody coming to evaluate my program, they're probably going to think, oh my God, they're coming to assess me. What's going to happen to me? Am I going to lose my job? Okay. So you always have to really journey are you going to take to answer the question? All right. Okay. I can just see no voice here. Am I back on? Okay. Methodology comes from ancient Greek methodos logos, which means knowledge along the way or knowledge along the journey. So the methodology, simply what are the steps? What is the journey you're going to take to answer the question? That's all. But when you decide a methodology, of course, you look at technical questions, such as what's going to be the design of my evaluation? Is it an experimental design, quasi-experimental? Is it theory? Is it case study? Is it action research? And I could go on and on and on and on. Okay, so there are technical aspects to methodology, such as the design of the evaluation, of the assessment. And here we share designs with research. Okay, they also use designs. But then there's going to be, how are you going to operationalize? How are you going to observe those things that derive from the choice you made in the approach? What is it that you are going to look at in order to collect it? All right. So if you have decided on an approach that is, for example, gender responsive or gender focused or gender based, what you are going to look at, either in terms of rubrics or indicators or situations, is going to be different from an approach that's, for example, a causal approach. Okay, not that one excludes the other, but what some will call evaluation criteria. Okay, that's what it is. It's how did you operationalize the approach? What is it that you're going to look at? Okay, so after the design, and design will help you identify as well what it is that you are actually going to look at. Then it's, well, how are you going to collect the data? Where are you going to get data? All right, is it primary data? Is it secondary data? And how are you going to collect that? Those are data collection methods. And there are really only three sources of data. Okay, there's what we saw, direct observation or participation. Okay, there's what we read, document review, and then there's what we heard. And these are interviews, but they can also be satisfaction surveys because people are telling you what they think, but they're doing it through a survey or a questionnaire. Okay, so think about, well, how am I going to get these data? What types of data am I going to collect? Where am I going to get these? Okay, and then once you have your data, and you can triangulate your data for reliability, because you need reliable data, you group your data to a question, and sometimes you have sub-questions. And these are your findings of fact. Okay, findings of fact are what we mean by evidence. We're looking at a school program, improve education, build a certain number of schools, among other things. We went out and checked, we looked, we took pictures of people, and we conclude that they built 10 schools. That's factual data. Those are findings. The findings of fact. But a finding doesn't tell you whether this is good or bad, right? You have to be able then to make an assessment as an evaluator using evaluative judgment based on the criteria or the basis that you've chosen, taking into account context. So this is how it allows you to provide conclusions. What I've described just now are the basic steps of methodology. All right, I'm going very, very quickly here. So I'm sorry, but because we have little time, I'm just giving you an overview. And hopefully one day we'll all have a chance to go to a restaurant and have chicken. No, we'll all have a chance to maybe do a workshop together and spend together to explore all of this in more detail. I'm going to keep moving, and maybe we'll have just a little time left if you have any questions. Managing evaluation. When I talk about methodology, I've talked about the technical part. And in choosing your methodology, you also have to think about the time and the resources that you have. Okay, we can't always do everything that we'd like to do. So we make choices on the basis of the reality. How much time have I got? How much money have I got or have I not got? I'd like to get data. I'd like to go and visit a place, but maybe I can't because it's winter, there's security concerns. So a lot of what makes up an evaluation is managing the evaluation. And in my experience, 80% of the success of an evaluation, and a lot of people are a bit surprised when I say this, is managing your relationship with whoever's commissioning the evaluation and the stakeholders. Okay, very often I see evaluators that don't take the time to sit down with the commissioner to really understand expectations. It's really important. You have to take your time at the front end. The inception or the planning phase is when you do that. And it's really important to take the time to make sure everybody is on the same wavelength. Because if you start and people have different expectations, when you come to the end, that's when you run into problems. Okay, budgets are important. Okay, for those of you who either consult or do evaluations for others, don't work for free. Okay, so think hard about what budget have you got, what is it that you can do, what is it that you cannot do. Think about the timeline, think about the confidentiality, think about how are you going to make sure that you respect ethics and so on and so forth. All this is part of managing the evaluation. And a final word, less is more. In other words, less is better. I very often see colleagues, particularly when they're coming from research backgrounds, who say, okay, let's collect all the data in the world. Okay, I'm exaggerating. Let's get all the data we can possibly get our hands on. The answer is no, don't do that. Only go for the data you need. And if at that point where you're analyzing, where you're assessing, you realize you need more data, you can go back and get a little bit more if you need it. There's nothing worse than spending half of the evaluation chasing after data, and then you end up with a huge data, very little time left, and it's very difficult to figure out what to do with it. Okay, so remember this: less is more, less is better. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I hope you found this useful. We didn't have very much time together. I do hope that we will have a chance, and I'll turn it over to Antonina in case there are questions or comments. Okay, so let me answer that question. Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah, okay, good. Okay, first of all, each evaluation requires its own basis for assessment, requires its own basis for judgment. Okay, do not use what I call off-the-shelf criteria. Now, you may wish to refer to criteria that were used in a similar evaluation or similar program. You may wish to find out about that, but you have to develop criteria that are specific to the evaluation that you're undertaking, and which is why you have to base it on your choice of approach. Are you using what I call a linear causal approach? Is it a social justice approach? What kind of approach, what kind of frame of reference are you using in order to assess the value of whatever it is that you're looking at? And that's really step number one, and you've got to think that through. See, that's the difference between being a professional evaluator and somebody who just comes along, takes something off the shelf, and then tries to apply it. You think that through, and then you can say, okay, now that I have decided, and typically it's good to do that with the commissioner, with the key stakeholders, that this is the main frame of reference. Here is how I am going to assess that. Okay, so that's how I would answer the question of criteria. There was another question that came up on ethics. Now here, did you have a more specific question? You say Anna. You say, yeah. Okay, so I can see here, if you're in the evaluation of real data, let's say should be shared with bodies, should probably move forward for now. Okay, yeah. Well, you see, what you have to, you can go on the website of the American Evaluation Association, Canadian Evaluation Association, and there are norms and standards for evaluation, including ethics and standards. The UNEG, the United Nations Evaluation Group, has norms and standards including on it, so you can go there and take a look. Now, more specifically, what you need to do is, when you think about managing the evaluation, is the questions of confidentiality, right? Now, typically, when you are interviewing people or surveying people, what you want to do is provide for the confidentiality of the data, okay? Very often, people will be much more comfortable talking to you if they know whatever they say to you is going to be safeguarded, all right? So if you're an independent evaluator and you're talking with somebody and what they're telling you indirectly is that, you know, their boss doesn't manage the program very well, of course, you know, they need to be confident that they can say that and not risk anybody finding out about it. So it's really important to be clear about it, to explain that to everyone, but it's also very important that the commissioner agree to it. Okay, it's extremely important. So that's got to be made very clear. Now, again, there's always a point at which you need to exercise some judgment. All right, you know, if, for example, somebody says something and it could have very, very negative effects. You know, somebody says, "Oh, you know, I think so and so, like over there, they're taking all the money and they're using it for something else," for example. Okay, you see, now this is something that you may wish to bring to the attention of whoever is competent to do that. But clearly, you would have to think through how you would do that in person. Okay, so in most cases, you know, 95 to 98% of the time, it's just a question of just being clear about how are you going to protect the data, protect the information. Manage the evaluation. Some commissioners will say, well, everything the evaluation belongs to the commissioner. We want everything. We want your notes. We want survey answers and so on and so forth. Very often, I will say, well, you know, you can have certain things, but you can't have others. And I've done assignments where they say, no, we want your field notes. I've said, no, I'm sorry. That's not something I'm prepared to do. But it happens extremely, extremely rarely.
Okay, so I mean, that's how you need to approach it. I have another here from Zoya about baseline. But you see, this is a very interesting question, okay? If you stop and you think about it, the notion of, you're welcome, Anna, the notion of a baseline belongs to a approach, right? The notion of a baseline is a before and after comparison. That's essentially what you're looking for, all right? So typically, baselines are used in causal. If you are using, for example, a systems-based approach, the notion of baseline does not apply, okay? Essentially, because if you're using a systems approach from the perspective of sustainability, it's not a question of looking at the change that occurred compared to the baseline or the starting point. It's a question of assessing the extent to which what is going on or not to contribute positively or negatively to the sustainability of the system and context. Okay, so you know, if you are looking, as I was asked to provide a critical opinion, quality assurance, on an evaluation that had looked at a program this was in the agricultural sector, to stimulate agricultural industry in Indonesia by promoting the development of palm oil plantations. All right, so the evaluation had looked at how well this had been done, how many new plantations had been developed, whether they were palm oil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, now whether or not this would contribute to helping to shift away from usual sources of fuel to more eco-friendly fuel. Okay, that was essentially the and so the evaluation they came at it from a causal perspective. You see, so they looked at the baseline. There were only 30 plantations. They were aiming to have 10. I'm making it simple here, but that's approach. Now that's a causal approach. If you take a systems approach, and if you begin to look at questions of sustainability, then the question becomes quite different. The question is, to what extent does this contribute to sustainability, not just of the enterprise itself, but of the ecosystem? And if you look at it that way, then it actually comes up negatively. Okay, and it's not a question of baseline. It's a question of those principles that we know about, do not respect, or be consistent with, do not allow for sustainability. And very simply put, is if you diminish biodiversity, if you monoculture over vast areas of what used to be primarily forest, we know this. I mean, research has shown this to us. You increase the risks of flooding, you increase the risks of landslides, you diminish diversity, it'll affect the production of other local agricultural crops, and so on and so forth. See? So these, depending on the frame of reference, depending on the approach, you might have a very different basis for making judgment, making an assessment. Now, in those cases where you do have a baseline, or you do need a baseline, I mean, there's different ways, you see, I mean, that you can assess. You can assess relative to where, what I say, there's sort of three ways to assess. Forwards and sides. Backwards, you can assess relative to where you were. How far have I come? How far have we come? And that's where you can say, okay, yeah, I do need to know where I started. So I do need something like a baseline. So that's fine, okay? But you could also say, I want to assess based on where I want to go, okay? So it's more a question of, did I get to where I want to go? But not where I started from is important, okay? And then that's the forward-looking. And sideways is comparing yourself to what others have done. All right, so that's a simple way of thinking about, approaches to assessment. These are other ways of thinking about this. Okay, there's a question about timeline. It's effective evaluation based on my experience. Well, you're welcome, Soya. We live in a world where there's information doesn't have a very long life in terms of its usability. Okay, and here I'll make a difference between data, findings, information, knowledge, and wisdom. Okay, so wisdom is the type of information that actually lasts for the longest. Data are that type of information which lasts. Okay, and somewhere in between there's findings and evaluation conclusions. So what you really have to think about is, what are you producing more of? Typically, we tend in evaluation to rely a lot on data to produce findings and conclusions. So the shorter the time frame, the greater the likelihood that the information you're producing is still going to be relevant. Okay. Again, that depends on context. You see, I personally, I don't do evaluations anymore. As I said, I don't do heavy lifting, but certainly over the last years I did evaluations. I focused on doing short evaluations. Evaluation, I don't go and wouldn't go near an evaluation. Is 6 months from start to finish. Okay, I don't know in most cases. Okay, then to get into these long drawn things that try to cover everything. So according to my experience, 6 to 8 months is probably a nice reference on that. I have a question here about the scope of the evaluation. How do we find the balance between the needs of the clients defined in the TOR and making sure the evaluation brings value? Okay, a very, very good question. Excellent question. One thing to understand is that when a commissioner prepares terms, you're welcome. When a commissioner prepares terms of reference, the commissioner doesn't necessarily see things clearly. Okay, the commissioner has her ideas, and very often commissioners, think that they know, how the evaluation should be conducted, what it should look at, and that's what they'll try to put across in the terms of reference. You see, so they are not necessarily either well informed or experts. It doesn't mean this is not important. Of course it is. But what you have to understand is that very often terms of reference are based on a particular idea of what the evaluation and can do. And the evaluation can do a lot more than that. It can bring a lot of value. I'll be coming to your question. The other thing you have to understand, the reality is that, particularly in organizations like UN agencies, then there's the procurement rules that also affect the terms of reference. Okay, so it's not about somebody sitting down and saying, okay, I'm just going to put these terms of reference out. They have to go to the procurement department where they have rules and regulations. The procurement officer gets involved and says, oh, yes, you have to have a grid and 30% for qualifications and 30% for budget, blah, 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 blah. Okay, and so what you're getting in terms of reference is an approximate project, if you wish, where different people have all put in their, and if you are responding to terms of reference, you've really got to keep that in mind. Okay, and what you try to do is you try to explain how you are going to do something that's consistent with the terms of reference. All right, and hopefully you do that in a way that they say, great, we'd like you to do the evaluation or do the work. And it's at that point where you plan, or you do what is called the inception. It's really, really important to engage with the commissioner. And that's the window we get to talk about the value, you see. And commissioners don't necessarily think in those terms. Commissioners think, oh, yes, we have to do an evaluation because the head office is asked for it. So we're going to do it, okay? Well, when you sit down to develop the plan, that's the opportunity to say, okay, we understand that you need to do this. This is also an opportunity to look at things that are maybe not in terms of reference, or not inconsistent with the terms of reference, but might actually be really helpful to you. Make this evaluation work for your program, you see? And so evaluation, the value of evaluation is for the most part in the process. It's a mistake to think that the value of evaluation is important. I mean, the report, of course, is part of it, but where you can really have a positive influence is in the actual way in which you do the evaluation. So communication is extremely important. Not only towards the end, it's from the start. And I sometimes mentor young evaluators. I'll take somebody under my wing. And I work with them, just mentor them. You need to come somebody well, train somebody well. And I've always said, investing a day at the front end on planning and really making sure that you communicate that expectations are clear is going to save you 7 later on. The ratio is 1 to 7. And if you're interested, I can probably dig up some of the research that I looked at years ago. So it's really worth the upfront investment, you see. And commissioners usually very much appreciate the opportunity to engage in that conversation, okay? It's really important to have. So remember, it's in the process of how you conduct the evaluation. You really have the opportunity to get the most value out of the evaluation. And do not confuse reporting with communicating, okay? You can prepare a report, but that doesn't mean that you've communicated the results. And I always say to when I teach in universities, so you have to. It's not about reporting on performance; it's about communicating value. Okay, there's different ways you can do that. There's different media. Okay? You can write, of course, on the report, but there's all sorts of other ways that you can actually communicate value. And you really have to begin to think in those terms. I don't know if there's anything else that people would like to say or ask.